In my early 20s, I was faced with what seemed like a huge dilemma. I was in my first relationship. I had been with this quite nice girl for 2.5 years, but for a long time I really had this urge to be free and to basically sleep with other women. I was bored, and the idea of spending the rest of my life with this first girlfriend was a source of deep anxiety for me. It took me a long time to face up to what those emotions really meant. They were, in retrospect, essentially a quite natural force that was urging me to go and spread my wild oats. Well, at the time, of course, it was very difficult to take responsibility for that decision. Breaking up with someone is a difficult thing to do because we create pain for not just ourselves, but often the other person, and often that person is someone who, although we feel the need to leave them, we do basically care about quite deeply. It's very difficult to see someone cry that you care about and know that basically that's your responsibility, that's your fault, the consequence of your choice to some extent. Of course, their own attachment does bring their own responsibility as well in the matter, but that's another issue. One thing I found, though, is in facing up to this decision that I approached many different people for advice. And it would seem that everyone I spoke to would give me different advice. And generally speaking, when I asked women advice, they would tell me that there's nothing quite like your first love and you should wait it out, and that you'll never be satisfied if you go around chasing other women. And when I spoke to men, they would often say, well, this is just your first love, things will, they always end like this, and there's plenty more fish in the sea, and this kind of thing. Well, what I learned through this process is that actually most people who offer advice don't really necessarily have your interests or your situation and your experience in mind. They are projecting their own situation, their own values, their own anxieties, their own desires about men in this instance, onto you, whether or not they're actually suitable to you, to your situation, whether or not they're actually going to reduce your suffering or lead to satisfaction and contentment or a resolution of your present suffering in that situation. And so I learnt through that process to be deeply, deeply wary of people who offer advice. So I don't want to necessarily advise you on this matter, but it is something I have noticed about advice givers, that often they are essentially quite detached from the reality of your situation as an individual and basically not able to give you advice. And this is why professional psychotherapists and counsellors do not offer advice. It is not their role. As people trying to help other people, they know that actually they cannot help other people by offering unsolicited and unwelcome advice. And in fact, they're more interested, I think, in helping people to take responsibility for making their own choices based on their own worldview, needs, reflections, values. And this is, in a way, the very essence of what it means to be authentic, to live your own life instead of the lives of other people. I think another problem with advice givers relates to this issue of authenticity and of responsibility for making choices in our lives. Making choices in lives is an anxiety-producing experience because when we make a choice, we exclude all other choices, and we never know if the choice we're going to make is or was the incorrect one. And on some level, I think the choices we make that trap us in commitments especially often plague people. There's a kind of basic insecurity that comes from the knowledge that they could have actually done otherwise, and they may well have been happier if they did do that. And often the people offering advice, I think, are coming from a position of essentially having followed other people's advice to begin with and harbouring some kind of resentment or insecurity about that. And in order to externalize and resolve that insecurity and the anxiety it produces, they basically want other people to do with their lives what they did with their own. It brings them comfort to maintain this idea that it's just the normal thing, that that's human nature, that people don't really have a choice, and I didn't really have a choice. I had to do all of those things that I didn't really want to do, and now I'm going to make damn sure that everyone else does exactly the same. This, I think, is incredibly problematic and essentially reproduces the dissatisfaction of that individual in the next generation or the people that they're communicating with. It isn't actually keeping that other person's best interests in mind. It isn't keeping their peace of mind in mind or really aiming to reduce their suffering. And it certainly isn't empowering them to live an authentic life based on their own decisions. On the contrary, it's really encouraging them to be inauthentic. It's projecting other people's values and expectations and ideas about what is normal and human nature and this and that onto other people. So I'm deeply, deeply wary of advice givers. I'm especially wary of people who give advice that is unsolicited and unwelcome. Usually that person is failing to take into account the individual differences between people. They don't really like the idea that people have radically different goals to their own, because the fact that people may choose to have different goals to their own implies that their own goals are simply contingent. They're based on choice. They're based on the choice of individuals, and that they could have chosen to have other goals instead of going along with the goals that they frankly probably internalized from other people as well, in an act of cowardly inauthenticity. I see this a great deal. Often, of course, people base their decisions and they follow the advice of their parents and essentially repeat the same mistakes that their parents did and suffer the same unhappy, dissatisfied life of their parents. And I think this is largely driven by these factors. There is a kind of corrupting force on the advice given. It means the advice is no longer actually necessarily about protecting the individual or reducing their suffering or helping them to achieve peace of mind if they are the goals that you happen to value. I assume some of you listening do want those things for your life, more peaceful lives. But actually the advice givers, when it comes to parents, often basically want you to make them grandchildren and have a good job that sounds good for their own social status game, so they can brag about how their son is a doctor or brag about how their son works for an oil company and makes $3 million a year destroying the environment, or whatever it happens to be. So I guess all I'm trying to say in this video, the advice that I'm giving, is that you should be deeply, deeply wary of advice givers and instead try to work out solutions and directions and goals yourself for your own life, and that is quite an important thing if you want to be an authentic, real human being who's actually living the fullest life they can with the short years that they are given.